Okay. Hello. So thank you for joining us for the last session of today, the second round of the afternoon. Okay, we'll just wait. So today's topic in the afternoon session is going to be about community and culture. And Margaret has joined us now, Kayla and Edgardo, in case you weren't here earlier. And so, Margaret, since you're joining us for the first time, maybe you can give a short introduction to your background and your own research and how it connects to community and culture, you know, and yeah.
So my name is Margaret McLaren, and I am a professor of philosophy, and I teach at a university in the United States. It's in Florida. It's called Rollins College. And my research for the last 12 years, actually, a little more, my research has been on women's cooperatives in India, and I'm interested in production cooperatives. And I got interested in it for two reasons. One reason is that I do a lot of theoretical work in feminist theory, and at least from the US and Anglo perspectives, but also actually Western European perspectives, the feminist theory tends to look at equality in terms of legal and political rights, but I have traveled a lot in the global south, and most people live, and most women live, in situations of poverty. They don't live in situations of excess. And so for many people, actually just having enough to eat, having food security, having enough nutrition, having health care for their children, those are the primary problems. Yes, of course, the right to vote is important, and the right to property, to inheritance, good divorce laws, those are all important. But if you're illiterate and can't get to the polls, then the right to vote is immaterial. So unless you have these kinds of fundamental rights, which are economic and social rights, you can't actually exercise your legal and political rights. So I was interested in shifting the discourse, or at least pointing out that it shouldn't always focus on legal and political rights. I don't know if I can shift it. I hope it shifts. And then the other thing that I was interested in, the other kind of theoretical problem I was interested in that led me to the research in India, is the idea, am I talking too fast? Okay. The idea that that rights and human rights somehow need to be abstracted from particular communities and cultures and traditions. That somehow tradition, in and of itself, or culture, was an inhibited rights. And again, I'm specifically interested in gender equality. It's not the only thing I'm interested in, but I was looking at it in terms of issues of gender and race and culture, kind of the intersections of those things. So a lot of times the idea is that you somehow, like, a lot of, again, European and US, so Anglo feminism, Anglo-speaking, but also not just Anglo-speaking, a lot of Western European feminism, would focus on culture like, well, wearing the veil is problematic, or, what else? Giving dowry, the practice of giving dowry is problematic, and then female genital mutilation or female circumcision. So there's a lot of different things that that it would focus on, and it sort of had this idea of, the white savior, and to me it smacked of imperialism and colonialism. So I was interested in exploring ways that women use traditions and their cultural background to empower them. So my work is actually primarily on textile cooperatives and women that produce like batik and block print, and use natural dyeing methods and use methods of production of textiles that mostly then are turned into clothes because they're working to sell them and make money. That how that actually contributed to their economic empowerment and actually their psychological empowerment as well. So how the idea that having rights or having more rights or more agency was not in an inverse relationship to culture and tradition, but actually culture and tradition can contribute to that. So it's sort of like how to take up identity in a positive way rather than try to deny it and suppress it and level it in order to get to equality.
Okay, thank you. So as before the break, we had already started talking about culture, and I think I'd be interested to talk about our different experiences, and not just in the arc, in our own lives, and how you think culture can bring communities closer, how this works on a global scale and through our global community, through the use of technology and social media to bring us closer as humans, or whether those factors are undermining culture and stopping progress. So I think that would be interesting to bring those in relation to your own research. So, for example, Edgardo, you've been doing a lot of research in the Afro-Caribbean about music and different communities there. Maybe you could explain a bit about that.
Well, I don't know what culture is, but I know there is a very nice aspect of culture, is pleasure. The humans and many other animals have the capability to feel pleasure, flavorous food, relaxation, no stress from outside. All this is able to produce pleasure. In social animals, and we are one of those, mammals, primates, physical contact is very important. It produces a kind of relaxation, pleasure. Aggression, physical aggression, produces irritation. So when you are uprooted, you are taken from your country of origin, you get a lot of stress and you start missing the links, the most, let's say, pleasant, I think is the English word, no? The sources of pleasure you were experiencing in your homeland. That occurred to the Africans in the diaspora. They were brutally moved from outside their continent after having wars among themselves, and then shipped to the Americas, to the United States, the Caribbean, Brazil, and so on. And you try to imagine, you are taking the people out of their mothers, their sisters, brothers, grandparents, the food they eat, the music they dance. So, and sometimes people move from Afro-Caribbean countries, for instance, to the United States, to very, let's say, large cities like New York City. Once there, Afro-Caribbeans were still trying to keep a link with their pleasure. And the salsa music is one expression of that. Sometimes Cubans say it is the Cuban son, appropriated by someone else, appropriated by Puerto Ricans, appropriated by New York, people in New York, the New Yorkers, Puerto Ricans in New York, Panamanian, Colombia. Some Cubans say that. Others, like Adalberto Alvarez, or the writer, the one who wrote about Leon Trotsky, well, I forgot his name. Leonardo Padura Fuentes. Yeah, you know him. Who was that? Thank you very much. Leonardo Padura Fuentes. They really believe it was something wider in the Caribbean with a core on the Cuba island, but going with us. And that helped people to keep, let's say, to stay alive. So to feel the pleasure of your roots, the music you are dancing, the mixture, the salsa you can make for mixing the sauce. Yeah, including, that's the meaning of salsa. You are mixing it, yeah, salsa in Spanish and Italian is sauce. So you are mixing, you are getting a Afro-Cuban basis. You still add something from Panama, something from Venezuela, from Colombia, and in different countries it started to get a different style. But all in all, it was the same, so really wide, flexible, and now even Japan became a Caribbean island. Where is Urara? Yeah, because there is a Japanese band, perhaps more than 20 years playing their music, yeah? La Orquesta de la Luz. So, but all in all, it is related to pleasure. But dancing cheek to cheek, body to body, is body expression. It's communication. You really try to, you know, you're dancing, you are flirting, she's over there, and you try little by little to, you know, to bring her closer. That's a way of getting, you know, in a tighter communication. It's related to pleasure. The music you are dancing should produce pleasure. The food you are eating, and all of this is interrelated. That's my experience. That makes a community more powerful, because you are getting the pleasures from your original community to stay alive.
Yeah, I mean, that's why the food was so important as a part of when designing the art, because basically, if you don't have good food in the community really, it falls apart. I mean, it really doesn't work. So asking, you know, when I was really thinking about the Ark, I was thinking we need a chef, because if we're going to eat pasta every night, like, you know, or baked potatoes, it's not going to work. Like most communities, they eat very basic food, and they don't eat like what we've eaten. You know, we've been spoilt by Denise. You know, I mean, the guidelines I gave her were really about the food has to be connected to the consciousness of each chakra, and we have to work through the chakras. And she came up with the idea is, why don't we work the opposite way round? So why don't we start at the top and work to the bottom? So we start at the crown and we work to the root, because we knew for the barbecue last night we would have meat and fish, and so we were thinking that's definitely more connected to the root. So it was very nice, because all the spiritual exercises and all the academic talks were going this way up the body, and then the food was going this way, and then we met in the middle. There was one day we were both in the heart chakra. And that was your day, Edgardo, when you were doing your biologist talk outside. But I think it's interesting what you're talking about, actually, because last night when we had the barbecue and, you know, part of the Ark, well, not part of the problem, but part of the challenge of doing a project like this in this kind of neighborhood where in some ways the center is connected to the community, and some ways it's not, you know. And so this idea of like, how do we connect to the local community, and what do the local community need? What do they like? What would they be interested in? And part of our thing was actually, you know, when I was designing this idea of a protest or a parade, you know, how we would interact, you know, after staying a week hidden in the Ark, how we'd go outside into the world, and how, again, play would come into it. You know, if we'd been really serious and gone out there and been like, we demand ecology, you know, if we'd been like real activists and, you know, taking everything seriously, we wouldn't have had as much good reaction or as fun. So I think, yeah, play and pleasure, you're right, definitely comes into it, and especially when trying to connect with communities. What do you think, Margaret? I mean, do you notice that in your research?
About play and pleasure? Yeah. And can I kind of go back also to your original question a little bit? So I think that my idea of community, and then what you talked about social media and kind of how that, so the communities that I'm interested in looking at have a long history together, face-to-face, working together, and doing a practice like making a batik shirt or doing block printing. But I think the element, and this actually is reflected in the Ark, so I'm going to blend these two questions, but the whole practice of making something together, like making a physical object together and working towards a goal, is really important in a community that already exists, and also in developing a community, and also in overcoming maybe rifts or tensions within the community. So one example in the research I do in India is one of the groups is located and started in Ahmedabad, India, and that's the city where there's been the most violent riots between the Hindus and the Muslims. So the groups of women that were working together and making these products for years and years, they were intentionally groups that had different religions represented. So not just Hindus and Muslims, but those are the two largest majorities, with Hinduism being the very largest majority. And so after the riots, people's neighborhoods were burned down and many people were killed, and they had to be moved to camps, to temporary housing, because the neighborhoods were not, their houses were gone. So the group, the Self-Employed Women's Association, they were instrumental in bringing those two communities, the Hindu community and the Muslim community, together after the riots. And it was because of the bonds and the relationships among the women who had worked together for many years. And those bonds and relationships were formed through making something together and having a common goal. And so to me, it's almost like community and tradition. The bonds that are forged there can also give rise to bigger projects. They can, sustain. They can be sustained in situations of conflict. And I do think there's a lot of play and pleasure too in the communities. Whenever I go to do interviews, because I go to India, I've been there 7 times, and I do interviews with people, and it's qualitative research. And you know, there's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of play. I remember the first time I walked into a cooperative, I was walking through raw sewage, and, you know, it was like a tiny, I mean, you know, they're working in a room like twice the size of that table, like 12 women, the sewing machines, some were like low, some were high, and they were laughing and talking, and they clearly were having pleasure, and they were clearly, even though they were doing it because, you know, they were poor, and they were doing it because they were earning money, there's this element of pleasure in being together, and I think that's important to, I don't know, maybe not so much for culture, but for community, to build community and to stay in community.
Yes. Yeah, no, I really like that answer, because obviously you're seeing the same things, you know, outside the Ark and being applied to making craft. I mean, even, you know, how craft is usually seen as a lower form of art. For us in the Ark, we think that craft and handmade things are just as equal to visual arts. Kayla, maybe I would be interested in hearing your reactions in terms of, you know, in terms of technology and in terms of apps and this kind of, you know, as we go into more virtual reality, and, you know, how, you know, this is, I'm just going to say a few things and you can tie them together. So one of the things when I was designing the Ark was also this idea of production. So what does it mean when taken out of a Marxist context and brought to nowadays, this context now? And so I wrote something which was quite funny, but can be misunderstood. And so I tried to write some slogans or some 4 foundations of the Ark. So they're called the Ark 4 Noble Truths, and the Noble Truths are, that's a riff on, in Buddhism, there are 4 Noble Truths, but my Noble Truths aren't really very connected to do with Buddhism. So I'll read the Ark 4 Noble Truths. So the first one is, a happy workplace is a productive one. The second is, working together for a plant-based future. Exactly, just like that. The third one is, be the best charismatic cult leader you can be. And the fourth one is community, cooperation and cult. So, and I also thought about that in terms of the banner, you know, because this area is more of a traditionally a socialist communist area, and the mayor's office is obviously very open and very supportive of this centre and allowing experimentation to go by. And so I thought it was funny to have this idea of production and, you know, talk about that on our banner outside. But I also thought with the Ark colours, you know, there are different times where I've tried to reference corporate culture, like IKEA, because a lot of our furniture is from IKEA within the centre, which is, you know, like you were saying, quite utopian, have a utopian design. And so the colours, but it's funny because nobody really realised that those were the IKEA colours until, you know, we were talking about it yesterday, you know, so. Within the art, there are these playful elements of bringing in like imagery or, you know, these ideas about corporation, technology, social media and stuff. And yeah, maybe you can talk about how that relates.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I guess, yeah, I'll try to talk about, but I do have to say that I actually, as a person who can't use many apps, I don't know that I have that much knowledge, but yeah, but I do think, and in terms of research that I've been doing and stuff that I was sort of reading also when coming here, I do think that social media, obviously everyone knows, plays a strong effect on our sense of community. But one of the things that I most recently read and found most interesting was about how we address like trauma through social media and these kind of news event traumas of just kind of passing things off onto each other, which happens a lot in social media. And I wonder if a lot of people feel relieved to be away from that for a week. I don't know. I mean, I guess that feels like what my social media is like when I look at it. There's lots of kind of like events and trauma being passed, you know, you kind of you can see it and share it, and you're sort of passing off this chain of reaction to people. And I have really weird feelings about virtual reality, because I kind of I kind of hate it, but I'm also making a virtual reality project. That's about, it's kind of post-apocalyptic, about these people that they focus so much on trying to recreate the world as a digital image that they forget about it. And but yeah, I mean, so in terms of culture and community, there are these really vast digital cultures and communities, and I think that it's become a real sort of place of being stuck lately between, because I mostly am looking at, when I'm writing about art, I'm mostly looking at art that uses technology, and we've kind of, or at least I feel like we've become stuck between loving the internet for all of the great things that it does, and you know, thinking that it's this amazing thing that brings people from all over together, and then realizing also the detriments of it and how it sometimes seems to be bringing communities together, but it actually is shutting down or foreclosing on these deeper conversations because of the way that people tend to communicate. Yeah, and in terms of this, this like kind of corporate versus utopia versus experimental, I think that's been really so smart and great because these things are so wrapped into each other. And I mean, one of the things we were talking about, and I hadn't really realized it because I guess I don't pay attention to what TED Talks are meant for, and then Grace like pointed out to me, there's one art project that we were talking about that is an amazing, it's an amazing proposal about, I feel bad that I don't know, whatever, I can give criticism on things. I love this project, but it's a project by an artist named J. Rim Lee called Infinity Burial Project, where she looks at what happens to toxins that are in the human body once you die and decompose and how they go back into the earth. And so she's thinking of environmental responsibility in terms of like not just things we do, but looking at what impact we have even after we die. And so she invented this mushroom, she kind of raise these mushroom spores that eat human, I know this is maybe to some people gross, they like eat the human body, but they also are detoxifying it and remediating all the toxins, and you sort of prepare when you know that you're going to die. You're taking these capsules and wearing this suit. And when I first found out about this project, I was like, oh my God, it's so amazing. It's still a little bit, for me, a little bit more dangerously on the solution side because it seems like it is solving a problem. It's not solving the problem in entirety because there's still a lot of other stuff to do. But then I revisited that project maybe a year after I first discovered it. And so she had given a TED Talk where she looks, you know, everyone is sort of looking at her like she's crazy because she's an artist and she's wearing this crazy suit. And has a really radical proposal in terms of thinking about, I'm really interested in, I mean, this is not related to community, well, actually it is, never mind, about the way that different cultures think of death and how that affects how we were talking about this, how that navigates how we think about climate change or the Anthropocene. But I revisited this project and found that it's now like a company that has this really like individualistic message of how to eliminate your own, how to absolve yourself of your kind of guilt over toxins. And so that's sort of this thing that takes you out of a community, and then you're sort of, you feel that you're able to just take care of yourself, where I think that is a really dangerous way to think. And so many things are focused on us just taking care of ourselves, at least like in the US, and, you know, and I think that that really, really limits the type of actions that we actually need that will really do something. Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting, because when you finally said that you'd look back at the project and how you'd been disappointed because on the first hand it was a utopian project, and then it become this really corporate project that only really rich people can buy these suits, and so it kind of went against this whole idea that it was going to be like very democratic and things. And yeah, of course, it reminded me of some sort of Soylent Green reference, you know, like some 1970s disaster kind of film. which made me also think about, you know, in terms of virtual reality and versus the shamanic way of looking at the world, you know, the non-linear shamanic, because the shaman really believes that different dimensions, there are different dimensions that are happening simultaneously while we're in this dimension. So we can obviously be talking here on this panel, but we can also be 50,000 years ago. And so this non-linear way of thinking about time, and so it is, I feel like this double consciousness about this Western, non-Western way of thinking about virtual reality is trying to mimic that, is basically trying to create holographically in some way that what you can do with your mind through, you know, doing shamanic rituals. So I think I'm quite interested in those two things. I've never worked with virtual reality, but because I'm coming from, I guess, from more the shamanic point of view. But just to bring it back to the art world, I did an exhibition recently 2 years ago in Glasgow, and it was a survey exhibition. And it was the first time that I was given multiple rooms. So I had textiles in one room, and then I had painting in another room, and video, and then performance and artifacts from performances and photography and stuff. And the way in my mind that I started to think about how to work with the room, because that's what the curator, for me, it works best when the curators support the play. You know, they help you and they guide you, but they don't dictate how it's going to be. Like, for example, with the Ark, you know, I was given certain perimeters, but then they gave me loads of room to experiment, and that was really great, because it wouldn't have worked if they had dictated who was going to come and, you know, the schedule, you know, it just wouldn't have worked. And this was also with this show in Glasgow that, you know, the curators kind of basically gave me free rein on how to arrange the room, so how to guide people around the show. And this is really an important thing, because that is what art historians and curators are trained in. They're trained in how to kind of, not manipulate, but like how to really construct how people enter an exhibition, how they see the work, the framing, you know, how the process works. But for me, whenever I go to an exhibition, or thinking about doing my own exhibitions, it's really, for me, the exhibition and all these different rooms are just different areas of the mind, you know what I mean? Like, it's like they're just compartmentalizing different. I mean, visually you're compartmentalizing because they're rooms and they've got walls and stuff, but it's really like that. And so how to make an experience holistic, you know, and that was good because that was in terms of objects, and so in terms of people would see the exhibition and they'd see a video, and so they had one relationship to time, but then they would experience a performance which would give them another relation time, and then so it was like layers and layers and layers, and it was really nice because people would come back to the exhibition and go away and then revisit. And so, and I think that was a good training in terms of then coming to design the Ark, you know, in terms of like thinking about how to make this a living thing, how to create it so we're in it and we're out of it at the same time, like how to have that double consciousness of being in and out. And so, yeah, I was really happy to be given, you know, and for you guys to, you know, be willing to try it and experiment with that, you know. Maybe you'd like to say say something about, do you think, you know, in terms of other cultures that you've been in, you know, and how, you know, I mean, you could relate it maybe to how the forest works in the Amazon, you know, how you've got different layers and different microcosms, you know, in terms of the different interspecies that work within these cultures. Do you see how different species, how, you know, do you see that reflected perhaps in how is there something that we can learn from how different species communicate and have communities? You know, like as a biologist, how do you see... Okay, that's too big of a question. All right, bit by bit. Okay, go on.
Wow. Well, first, as a scientist, I am obligated to address the relationships between individuals, populations, and so on, intra and interspecific, from quite a material point of view, materialistic point of view. Now, I will try to say something, give some hints according to this. My science is not enough for understanding whether other animals others than humans, or even other living beings, have the same thing we call feelings, all right? Now, plants communicate to each other. They have, for example, there are chemical signals. We use chemical signals. We smell each other, yeah? You don't realize it, but that's why it's effective. That's why it's effective. Yeah, the smell of a person. Ants communicate using also the smell. Bees communicate to each other depending on how they are flying. It means something. Now, for plants, you get root interactions, below ground interactions, and some plants don't tolerate other plants to be close there nearby. They need to grow up. They don't think on it, but by means of natural selection, some plants develop what we call allelopathic substances. They produce something poisonous against other plants, throw it in the ground, and it is a kind of chemical signal. When another plant is coming, gets the message, can die, not progress. They have no brain, and that's why biologists say, okay, they don't think. But all in all, it is another direction, another path of evolution. Among microscopic beings, you have things really irritating. You get the same kind of signals, and you avoid your predators. Amoebas, for instance, they are predators. The free-living amoebas, you can look at them in a microscope. You find them even in YouTube. They are predators. And in YouTube, you find some didactic videos showing the amoebas eating, just like saying, no, they feed from other Paramecia, for instance. They are other microscopic living beings. And there is a video I have in my website for students. One amoeba getting to Paramecium, and the Paramecium trying to escape. Okay, it hurts us. Still, we don't know whether they have that. So, but the signals are there. Inside the cell, there are signals. You have DNA in the nucleus. You have RNA transcribing some signals, getting out of the nucleus, and then producing in the ribosome some proteins, allergic reactions, another stimuli, and secretions for digesting something, and it depends. It is also a way of reacting to the environment. Flowers are important because flowers having similar smells and similar shapes attract similar insects, and then this insect is able to help flowers from the same species to mate to each other. Sometimes they go to another species and you get a hybrid. So apparently the sexual communication, it is not designed for, it is not thought for to be like that. Sometimes it fails, but what the resulting plant is alive and grows up and does well. So trans-specific contacts are present. My knowledge is not enough for saying if there is something, let's say, spiritual behind it. But what we can learn is that we are still, in spite of all, we are still animals, and we can use our own, what we are every day using our own pheromones, gestures. How do we look into each other? How do we move? We have this communication, and this is very, very old communication, and you find it in other animals too. Face expression, for instance, smells. You find them in other components of the animal kingdom.
And so in terms of patterns, just thinking about what you just said, in terms of how microorganisms use patterns or show up in patterns under the microscope, do you think that relates, I mean, maybe you can't answer this and maybe one of you can answer this, about, do you see how, you know, in terms of patterning, you know, because this idea that these microcosms are just reflecting the macrocosm as society, you know, how these patterns get reflected. Maybe you could say something about that, or how you see it, or even in the textile patterns. Like, I think patterning is quite an interesting way to go.
I might have to think about that for a second. I'm sorry.
I just had a very interesting conversation with Margaret Harris, who's in the audience, who is a visual artist and also a writer, and she has some images or some work that has a repeated pattern in it with that's African textiles. So maybe she can talk about it later, or you know, if someone could give her a microphone. But I would actually, so not so much with the textile patterns, but we talked a little bit in here about how the ark was a microcosm of the larger world. And you had said to me a few times before I came, and also to us as a group, that you were thinking of it as a laboratory or an exploration of a possible model for looking at and working out sustainable communities, right? So it's a small one, 15 people, short time, it was temporally bounded, right? But I think that it does, and then within the arc, we talked a lot about how, and even on an earlier panel, people were talking about identities, the issue of identity, and how Gleb said, I think, that the issue of identity and how people other someone else and think of them as the enemy, that's repeated at the state level and state relationships between different nations. So microcosms and macrocosms, I think part of it is that there's microcosms and macrocosms on all different levels. So during the arc, the process of the arc itself, I thought a lot about, you had mentioned this one day before meditation, that you set it up as integrating the spiritual and political elements intentionally, because you'd been in a lot of communities where those were not integrated. And in fact, not just not integrated, but one was devalued, right? In the spiritual community, the political is devalued, and the political community, the spiritual is devalued. And I've had that experience in my life. I haven't lived in communities like you, but I'm active in both a spiritual and a political life, and they're sort of separate for me. So I really appreciated the integration of those aspects. So on one level, I think a lot about how our individual work, our spiritual work, actually is related to what we do in the outside world and how we treat people and what happens. So we're kind of like a microcosm of the larger community, in this case, as individuals within the arc. And the arc itself was like a microcosm in the larger community. And then what does that mean in terms of, could we really build a community where we were looking for constructive alternatives to the future, a more plant-based society, a future in which human relationships were valued, where creativity and art were valued, where people did what needed to be done and functioned together, but were also working towards a larger goal, like better solutions for the planet, which is a huge goal. So it made me think a lot about those things, and I do think that there's both at the biological level, right? Within the organism, there's microcosms. Then we're like, individuals are microcosms, and then there's larger communities that we're a part of. And so it's a kind of reflection. And I do think we need to work on multiple levels in order to have the kind of future that we want. Because I think if there's radical kind of contradictions or paradoxes between those things, then it breaks down. You have to have you have to have sort of harmonious relationships within any kind of community, even if those harmonious relationships involve that one cell absorbing the two other cells. Sometimes that happens, but there's sometimes harmonious relationships are symbiotic, and sometimes there are other kinds of relationships. So I think so I think sort of like expanding our knowledge of what would count as a harmonious relationship, and thinking about the impact of this community, the ARC, on Aubervilliers, and then also the larger community.
I can maybe, the things you're saying remind me maybe like in a, I guess kind of tied between the two of you, something I've been interested in is, and it's something that's happening more in art and theory, but I think it's something that's kind of being pulled from stuff that was already going on, but it's been brought into this like Western academia, and art is searching for and kind of really trying to grapple with non-human and more than human communities and assemblages, and kind of what that means in terms of looking at all of the other things that are both part of our bodies, in terms of kind of, to go back to that example of J. Rim Lee's work, but like there are also some artists who have worked with looking at other organisms that live in our bodies and how those might influence our thoughts and our cultures. And sort of asking then, what does it mean, or how can we think, if we're dealing with these ecological problems that of course affect us but also affect others, that other species, if there's a way for us to look at that in a broader sense and kind of think of not just what happens to us but what happens to others and who we leave behind, whether it's, you know, us and everyone else, or, you know, how we kind of negotiate that. And that's something that yeah, that for some reason kind of kept getting, well, not for some reason, because you planned it. Oh, no, I mean, like, because, yeah. Because of intelligent design. That kept... I like that. But that's something that, yeah, that's something that came up throughout our conversations, even informally, in terms of thinking of our relationships with other species. And then I weirdly was reading these Octavia Butler stories about where humans are in parasitic relationships where we're not the parasite, where a parasite is sort of, we're host to a parasite, which I mean which does happen, but on these like smaller scales, and that goes back to our alien invasion game in a weird way. But but I think it's to me it's really interesting to be more open about how we imagine the future in terms of looking at this human and non-human ways, and how we learn from other species. And that was the thing that came up in terms of the performance as well, in terms of the endangered species. And Anna and Ulala were talking about this sort of movement called the Lazarus Project that's trying to de-extinct or kind of bring these animals back from extinction. But they're usually species that we value for some reason, mostly because they're beautiful or they're strange. And then that gets into this really complicated thing of where we're really constructing our world in this kind of top-down way. And so I'm interested in how it seems to me it's come up in so many things about looking at this sort of bottom-up way. Yeah.
Do you want to say what you've been scribbling?
If I can. Now, thank you for steering me to the point I really wanted to come. Okay, my science is not enough for understanding how plants relate to each other, whether they have thoughts, ideas, communications, and whether other animals are able to do that. However, there is something even more beautiful. Let's just be anthropocentric for a certain time. I disagree with anthropocentrism. Biological thought, as we learn it in the school and so on, is anthropocentric. It's Western biased. But let's be Western biased, let's be anthropocentric for a little time, okay? Now imagine that we are better than other plants and animals. We are better. Still we have gardens. You see the ladies watering the plants and talking to the plants. You see the farmers producing crops, and they really think on how is the best way to manipulate the plants, how length, or how wide they spread them, how often they need to give them water. They engage in a kind of love relationship with nature, provided that they understand that nature is more powerful. So, to me, okay, I have no skills for defining whether plants communicate to each other, but I find very beautiful the way humans communicate with plants and animals. The only idea that, the only thinking that there are cultures in the world having the idea that plants and animals have chakras, for instance. Yeah? There's people who believe it. To me, this is beautiful. They are introducing the plants and the animals into something very intimate and beautiful and making us to feel better. So the other thing is, now let's come back to the limitations of biological thought. Or one thing is this, how do you call it? The intelligent design. Yeah? Evolution is such a powerful science that many people think, okay, adaptations are perfect. Yeah, and there is an intelligent design behind it. No adaptation is perfect. If any living being would be perfect, then there would not be evolution. There would be no natural selection, no exclusion, and no capability to get adapted to different contexts. So we don't need an experimental designer because we are imperfect, and it is better to be imperfect or not be perfectly adapted to anything in order to get the chance to get adapted when the context changes, because the context is changing all the time. So, and humans as parasites and so on, it really depends. There are cultures in the Alps, the South Tyroleans, in Slovenia, the farmers in the Amazon, in Mexico, West Africans and in other areas of Africa making agroforestry systems and so on. If people recognize that nature is more powerful, then you immediately start to think about, okay, how can I make an impact letting nature to recover? How do I take advantage of an animal and even kill it for eating and then let the populations to recover and so on? And it implies that we are sometimes parasites of cows, for instance, or we are, in many cases, we're in symbiotic relationships. We are feeding the cows are feeding us. Yeah. We are sometimes predators. We are hunting. We kill a whole animal. We are predators. Sometimes we are herbivores. And many relationships among species and between humans and other species are harmonic. And the Western bias in biology has made many people to believe that there is a lot of competition, and you know, I am a tree here and you are the other tree and I have to cover you because I need the light from the sun and I am competing you, and everything is spinning around competition, and you find it in many textbooks, you know, and it is not like that. It is just that ecology started to occur as a science and evolution during the Industrial Revolution, where social Darwinism was assumed to be a good idea, and it's not. It's not. I mean, Darwin was not the social Darwinist. But okay, too much. Sorry.
Thank you, Edgardo. Yeah, maybe we could just open to a question from the public. Any questions? Okay, is there anything you'd like to say as a finishing? Or
Sure. Actually, I'd just like to express my gratitude first to the staff of Labos, the Laboratories de Aubervilliers, for opening up the space and supporting this project. And also, sincere thanks to Grace for organizing the project and all the work and time and thought and energy that she put into it. For me, who I'm often, like Gleb said, like I'm usually at academic conferences, you know, I just go and give my paper. This was a totally different experience. I've never been a part of a performance art project before, although I have many artist friends actually, and I hang out and go to galleries and openings there and see their stuff. But it was an amazing experience, and I feel like we created a community here, and I think that's difficult to do. So I really appreciate both the Labo staff and also Grace, the artist, organizer, designer, and all my fellow Archies and the public who came today.
Have you got something to say, Kayla? Edgardo, any final words?
Merci beaucoup.
Ah, perfect.
Thanks for all.
Yes, so thank you for coming today, and yes, thank you. Oh, if you filled in a questionnaire, could you give it back